At the moment, we're looking at a 1-degree rise in the Earth's temperature, which is due to our greenhouse gas emissions. But even so, we're lucky because a large proportion of those ends up being absorbed either by oceans or by plants and soil. This covers about half of all human emissions every year.
When a jellyfish eats a shrimp, it helps to store carbon in the ocean. When an earthworm digests and breaks down organic matter, it traps carbon in the soil. Forests and oceans are able to capture CO2 in the atmosphere and store it in mineral form deep below the surface. For this reason, they're known as carbon sinks. For many scientists, studying and understanding these natural carbon sinks in the hope of making them more effective and protecting them in the long term has become a priority.
There is a large community of scientists, not just in France, but worldwide, who are working across many different disciplines. We have oceanographers, but also agronomists, biologists, physicists, chemists, specialists in numerical analysis, all of whom are joining forces to understand the fundamental processes of the carbon cycle.
The world's natural carbon cycle is disturbed by human activity, which releases large quantities of greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. Carbon sinks only absorb about half of the CO2 that we produce. The other half eventually mixes with the atmosphere and contributes to climate change.
The ocean absorbs carbon dioxide in a number of ways. The first is known as the physical carbon pump, where the current quite simply draws the CO2 below the surface and pulls it down into deep water. But there is also the biological carbon pump, where living organisms absorb the carbon at the surface, then carry it down and store it on the ocean floor.
These two processes make the ocean our most important carbon sink. With the physical pump, the CO2 in the atmosphere dissolves naturally on the surface. When the air comes into contact with the water and is drawn down into deeper water by powerful ocean currents. This process is especially common in cold oceans, which absorb more CO2 than warm oceans. The biological pump relies on photosynthesis. Up on the surface, vegetable plankton, also known as phytoplankton, absorb the carbon dioxide and use the energy provided by sunlight to convert it into organic matter. When the plankton die, some of them will sink down through the water and store part of the carbon deep on the ocean floor. The rest will be consumed by animal plankton or zooplankton. The zooplankton produce fecal matter, as well as other dead organic matter, which in turn store carbon as they settle in the ocean sediment. Of the countless species of phytoplankton and zooplankton, researchers have taken a special interest in diatoms and salps, two forms of plankton that play an active role in carbon storage. Diatoms capture sunlight with their chloroplasts and use photosynthesis to convert it into organic matter. Some of this matter coalesces until its mass is great enough to draw it down to the depths. Part of it is also eaten by zooplankton and by salps in particular. These creatures act as a kind of living vacuum cleaner, filtering hundreds of liters of water every day. Each salp produces a large quantity of dense fecal pellets, which will in turn sink and become part of the sediment on the seabed.
The main purpose of our work is to gain a greater understanding of how oceans functions, for example, in their role as a natural carbon sink. We also work on projections because society wants to know what's going to happen to this vital carbon sink over the next few decades. To do so, we need all sorts of data. We need to find out how the carbon sinks will respond to changing CO2 levels and the changing climate. And we must elucidate the delicate processes at work in the ocean carbon sink, which will influence what happens in years to come. Recently, lots of discoveries have been made. We now know that vortices have a powerful effect on the absorption of CO2 by the ocean. That's something we weren't aware of until very recently. There are also biological processes between the surface and the seabed. We've learned a lot about the biological carbon pump, but there's still more to learn about how this biological pump will be affected by climate change. Mika, can you rinse this out, please?
By taking samples from the deep sea throughout the year and studying the fecal matter, waste, and dead matter that they find, researchers are able to assess the processes of sedimentation and carbon flow.
In any given particle trap sample, we find aquatic life, but also other captured materials. It's an assortment of passive organic matter, as you can see here. There's phytoplankton, there's also fecal matter, a little bit of everything. All these particles are very fine. They sink down and coalesce. All of this matter that sinks, that's the flow of carbon in action.
This instrumented buoy, known as Boussole, will measure the physico-chemical and biological processes that contribute to carbon capture. Satellites and profiling robots will also be put to work with the shared task of locating clusters of phytoplankton and understanding how the biological carbon pump functions in deep water over time.
Here we have a map of phytoplankton levels, which was taken from a satellite. The warmer colors, like yellow and orange, are the areas where levels are very high. And the colder colors, these blue zones, have very few phytoplankton. From this, we can see that during summer, there are intense blooms of phytoplankton in the higher latitudes. And these plankton are producing organic matter, which can potentially lead to the transfer and capture of carbon. In the last 10 years, we've begun to use profiling floats, robots that are different to satellites in that they observe the whole water column from the surface down to a depth of around 2,000 meters.
Until now, most studies were carried out from a boat. You can put a research vessel in a certain location at a given time, but you can't ask scientists to spend years on the same vessel to take measurements. The advantage of robots is that they enable us to obtain temporal series because they can stay at sea for up to 5 years. By providing us with continuous information, they give us a better insight into how the biological pump functions, not only concerning the gravitational factors, in other words, the sinking particles, but also with regard to the migration of organisms, which we may be able to characterize, along with certain ocean currents that pull the organic matter down to the seabed. These robots start at a depth of 2 kilometers and rise to the surface. Then they transmit their data via satellite back to dry land. The scientists are even able to send commands and tell the robot to change the parameters of its mission. Once the data is captured, the whole community can access it in less than 24 hours. This is a great example of data sharing on an international scale to help shed light on a global issue that affects us all.
photos taken by the robots show collections of organic matter as it sinks towards the bottom of the ocean. This will allow the researchers to assess how effectively the carbon is being stored.
You have to bear in mind that for every, let's say, 500 grams of carbon that's produced in 1 square meter of ocean, you might find only 10 grams or so once you get down to a depth of 500 meters, because the other 490 grams will have been consumed by various particle-eating predators that dwell in the water between the surface and a depth of 500 meters. So although the ocean has this colossal capacity to absorb carbon through photosynthesis, its ability to transfer it to the bottom of the ocean is actually very limited. Only 10 grams make it to a depth of 500 meters. Then, when you get down to 1,000 meters, it's usually closer to 1 gram. This means that 99% of the matter produced in the first 50 meters of ocean, which gradually sinks down, has been consumed by the organisms that live in the deep water.
This is why only a small fraction of the CO2 captured by plankton on the surface will be stored in the deep ocean. Furthermore, recent research suggests that the ocean's natural capacity to absorb carbon is shrinking.
A number of theoretical works show that climate change could reduce the ocean's capacity to capture carbon. As a very plain example, the principal mechanism that allows carbon dioxide to be dissolved in the sea is the fact that it is soluble in seawater. It then gets carried by currents, mixes in with the deeper water. These types of physicochemical processes are what make the ocean such a carbon sink. In the future, these processes may be less effective. Firstly, because temperatures are rising. When the surface of the sea gets warmer, the gas becomes less soluble, and the ocean is less effective at pumping it. The second mechanism is that ocean currents are already changing due to climate change. The ocean is becoming more stratified, with less cross-flow between the surface and the deep water. So the carbon dioxide captured on the surface will mix less easily with the deeper water, making the ocean less effective at pumping CO2.
There are, however, coastal ecosystems, such as mangrove forests or these fields of Posidonia, found in the Mediterranean, that act as major carbon sinks in both the short and the long term. Put together, these marine plants cover an area larger than the Amazon rainforest. It would therefore seem that studying and preserving these immense underwater prairies should be of the utmost priority.
There are several aspects to consider. Firstly, it's vital that these ecosystems of marine plants are preserved and kept intact. That's a real problem because many are being destroyed by human activity. For instance, the mangroves in the intertropical zones are being deforested to make space to build shrimp farming ponds. As a result, the carbon that was stored there for decades or even centuries is released into the atmosphere. So these systems that were once absorbing carbon are now emitting it. That's exactly what we shouldn't be doing. Secondly, we can also look into ways of increasing the carbon storage capacity of these ecosystems. For instance, by restoring those that have been damaged, because not only do these ecosystems fix carbon, but they're also breeding grounds where fish come to reproduce. They act as a kind of nursery. These are steps we should be taking immediately. We know how to do it, we know that it works, and that it generates all kinds of positive side effects.
The carbon sink process doesn't only operate at sea. It also works on land in the same way. Vegetation captures CO2 from the atmosphere through contact with the air. All plants release organic matter, from dead branches to decomposing leaves to dried out roots. And these, in turn, are used by the living world, from springtails to beetle mites, millipedes, and eventually bacteria. Then, water and earthworms carry the carbon down into the ground in mineral form, where it remains trapped in the soil.
The roots are doing their job. And the fact that there's organic matter, it changes the structure and density.
The density, you see, it's almost like butter.
Yes, there's a lot of activity, which contributes to aerating everything.
The colors are there's a lot of contrast.
The dark color is the carbon produced by the tree status, turned into organic matter and stored in the soil. The closer you get to the surface, the more carbon there is, because it's brought there by the plants.
One of the purposes of the project we're working on is to estimate the storage potential of not only agricultural soil, but also forest soil and pasture soil across the whole plain of Versailles, and to see whether there are any ways to improve that storage capacity across these three types of soil.
For these soil scientists, the aim is to compare the respective durations of carbon storage in forest soil and agricultural soil.
There's a clear difference between these two samples.
Is that the sample from the forest?
This is the forest, this is the farming. In the forest, there's one peak early on and a second one here, which means this label fraction here is much higher in the forest than in agriculture.
Indeed, indeed. That's pretty much what we expected, but it's even more obvious here.
The analysis confirms it, and what's interesting is that we can also quantify it.
By using these signals, we can determine the amount of stable carbon in any given soil sample. Stable carbon is the term for carbon that remains in the soil for at least 100 years.
The studies show that carbon captured in forest soil is released in larger quantities than that stored in agricultural soil. One possible solution is to increase the organic content of agricultural soil, especially as this would also improve soil fertility. But how can the additional carbon be stored in the soil for as long as possible?
99% of the food we consume comes from the soil. The ocean alone isn't enough to feed us, so it's essential that we preserve our soil. Since agriculture was first introduced, intensive farming practices have deprived the soils of much of their organic matter. And our projects, the projects that I'm managing, especially those focusing on compost and biochar combinations, will contribute to restoring organic matter levels in the soil and help it function as efficiently as it once did.
Biochar is vegetable biomass that's been subjected to pyrolysis. This means it's been broken down without the presence of oxygen and is therefore very rich in stable carbon. This makes it difficult for microorganisms to break it down. While compost is also vegetable biomass, it's been treated differently and is made from much fewer stable elements than biochar. The main benefit of biochar is that it's a lot more stable as a substance and it's very porous, so it can hold a lot of water and is a very good habitat for microorganisms.
Increasing organic matter levels will help to restore the soil's functionality in terms of its carbon storage, water storage, and nutrient storage capacity, as well as the energy available for microbe activity. Effectively, it means bringing the soil back to life. This combination is very important because it means that not only can the carbon be stabilized, but soil fertility and agricultural productivity can also be improved. This will therefore enable us to fight famine, for instance, and help ensure food security for the 10 billion people who will live on our planet in 2050.
At the moment, agricultural practice produces greenhouse gases, and food production is responsible for 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. But there's actually plenty of room for improvement. Instead of emitting greenhouse gases, we have the ability to adopt farming techniques that increase carbon storage. It could be in trees via agroforestry or in the soil using agricultural conservation techniques and agroecology. This means having a mixture of mutually beneficial tree and plant species to help enhance the amount of carbon stored in the soil.
Partly inspired by traditional farming practices, soil-based carbon storage techniques are steadily improving and also benefit from significant breakthroughs in soil biology research.
The number of new initiatives in the agricultural sector, for instance, is quite extraordinary. Experiments are being carried out on every scale, from the smallest farm to the largest industrial operation, combining a cereal crop with a cover crop, for example, in order to increase the quantity of carbon in the soil and create biomass to turn into methane gas. So there are many different solutions. They involve systematic changes, but also changes in our way of life, so we can move towards a truly sustainable society.
What we're trying to show is there's no silver bullet. The only real solution is to cut emissions by reducing our energy use, adapting our technologies, and so on. That's the first step. In any case, climate change is already happening. We have no choice but to adapt to it. And to do so, we need to be able to forecast how our emissions will influence this phenomenon.
Between now and 2030, we would need to cut our CO2 emissions in half in order to reach net zero by 2050. This means not releasing more CO2 into the atmosphere than humankind is capable of removing and storing in a sustainable way. And although our land and ocean carbon sinks absorb about half of our CO2 emissions, their ability to store it must be protected. While carbon sinks may indeed help to combat climate change, they can also fall victim to it.